President walking through the portico, presumably to head back to the White House, and by his own admonition, ready to get to work after the congressional luncheon. The speech lasted just over 16 minutes, I think we calculated, Jen, and Chief Justice Roberts administered the oath of office using two Bibles. One was from President Lincoln's inauguration, the other given President Trump by his mother in 1955.
Rick, I know that you were writing for, all of us were, in fact. Let's break down the speech if we can. First of all, your initial reaction. Was it what you expected that it would be?
Actually, it was not quite what I expected. That may be surprising because what you did hear were some Donald Trump themes. I mean, these are very much the themes of his campaign and the themes of his transition. He talked a lot about America first. He talked a lot about patriotism. He quoted the Bible, made references to God a number of times. It wasn't quite as conciliatory as I would have expected. During the campaign, I used to say that the best debater was Ted Cruz. The best orators were Barack Obama and Marco Rubio. But the person who connected with voters best, at least during the campaign, was Donald Trump. This was a speech appeared to be directed to the people of the country, the blue-collar workers, those who've been forgotten, particularly those in the Midwest. It was a little bit more of a, I might say, combative speech than I was expecting. I was expecting more conciliatory terms, tone. It wasn't obviously the eloquence of the oratory of a Lincoln or an FDR. But Donald Trump is not them. He's being Donald Trump. He's being more direct. He speaks directly. I have to say I was a little bit surprised by the speech. I expected it to be a little bit more lofty, but also a little bit more conciliatory. Although, don't make any mistake, he said we numerous times. He had lots of themes of doing this together. But it was a speech that did surprise me.
Are you saying that he's throwing those who came before him under the bus?
No, not at all. Donald Trump is being Donald Trump. He's being true to who he... I think this speech reflects a lot of who he is and a lot of his thinking. It is a very much an America First thinking. It is a patriotic speech. It's about those people who've been forgotten. He's particularly talking about manufacturing in the Midwest, but more than just that. So it was a speech that was workmanlike. It reflected who Donald Trump is. Obviously, someone who worked with him in particular words. I think this speech did reflect Donald Trump.
Senator, as a Democrat, what resonated with you? What surprised you? What impressed you?
I have to think about that. I wrote some notes. Well, the surprising part was the non-conciliatory piece and almost the same thing that he said about John Lewis just recently, which I didn't think, bridged the unity he was, I think, trying to go towards, or mentioned it a little bit. I didn't think it bridged that. I didn't hear a lot of hope for all, and I didn't feel extra encouraged about what's to come. To me, there was pretty much the same kind of campaign lingo, and not much talk about, even though, we're going to take the country back from wherever it's been given to, I'm not sure, but how are we going to do those things? And I think there should have been a little bit of policy component, because how we get from where we are to where he thinks we should be will be by policy and not just by words.
Dr. Michkowski, your impression from a historical point of view. And first, your reaction. Was it what you thought it would be?
Well, there was one thing that surprised me. It was a lot shorter than I thought it would be. But there was a theme of rebuilding and renewal that permeated parts of the speech. What did surprise me, and I think this speech will be remembered for its focus on domestic issues. A lot of inauguration speeches do tend to look abroad and contrast America with countries abroad and emphasize American freedom. This speech emphasized Trump's base, citizens, workers, the people. He repeated those things. Really, he didn't use the word cleaning up the swamp, but that was the idea: get power out of Washington and redirect it back to the people. And the focus on domestic issues in almost a martial, pugnacious kind of tone was striking, I think. He talked about shuttered factories, and in a very, very forceful way, jobs for people. Mentioned domestic issues like even space and energy. So I think its focus on domestic issues was singular. The only time really he mentioned foreign issues was to single out radical Islamic terrorism, as he has done on the campaign trail.
And Rick, when you look at these speeches and you go back and look at the verbatims, you look for something that may be quotable in the future, like John F. Kennedy's "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Is there anything that in particular that was said that you think will be drawn from that speech that people will look back and say, that was a defining quote?
There will be several. I don't know the exact language, the language about those who've been forgotten. And there are a couple different times where he said to make sure to hear me now about this kind of language. He did have that language in there. But let me just say this about these speeches. Typically what's most memorable is the times in which they're given. For example, they say the most memorable speech was 1865 with Lincoln following the Civil War, and FDR during the Depression. Today, a very divided nation, dramatically divided. And this speech, 16 minutes as it was, is an opportunity for both unity, heal the divide, conciliation. I like the professor's word. I think it was a little more pugnacious than might have been expected. I think there's some language that's fairly quotable, but I think what will be remembered most is sort of the tone and the style. It was focused on domestic policy, but it was also focused on a very nationalistic themes, some very national, and a sort of a we versus them. And I think he's more comfortable if there's a them out there. And for him, that them is going to be D.C. and the politicians and the establishment. And the we is him and the workers of this country and the people of this country. At the very beginning of the speech, he talked about it's not just the transition of power of administrations, it's the transition of power from Washington to the people.
The people that are sitting there listening to that speech at home and on the mall and what have you, do they feel part of that we, do you think?
I think the answer to that is some. And I think that may go to the senator's point. I do think that this speech does go well to his base, and it speaks well to those who supported him. For those who did not, they might have been looking for a little bit more here, quite frankly. But the overall themes are very consistent with what he ran on, very consistent with who he's been, and where his comfort level is. He's comfortable talking about rebuilding infrastructure. He's comfortable on domestic policy. I think his lack of comfort shows on foreign policy, and clearly the speech did not have much of a tone in terms of foreign policy at all.
So, Senator Gibson, no room for prejudice, he said.
I saw.
God's people need to live together in unity, black, brown, or white, all bleed red as patriots. You mentioned, of course, John Lewis. We've been following that story for several days now. Was that enough to bridge the gap, the racial divide that, we have seen these last several months?
I think not. I mean, all of us are full of patriotism. I don't think that there are non-patriots in any race or in any party, but I think the warm and fuzzy was missing. It was just very stoic, and it sounds really nice, but then right after that, to use the same language or words that you use to talk about John Lewis just kind of negated the whole thing.
So you don't think it was enough to even open the door?
I think Donald Trump has been divisive. President Trump has been divisive from the start. And so the whole Take Back America theme and is not inclusive as far as I'm concerned. And he tried to spin it as if, to me, minorities and immigrants have taken everything from everyone else, and that is far, far from the truth.
President Trump and former President Obama, Vice President Mike Pence, and former Vice President Joe Biden walking down to Marine One. The next step in the inaugural festivities is that congressional lunch. Dr. Michkowski, let me go back to the whole foreign policy issue, because you know that Angela Merkel in Germany, Britain's new Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, they were all watching. How do you think they'll take that speech?
I think they'll take it with some measure of concern. I think one of the themes, one soundbite that you can distill from this speech is two words: America first. Buy American, hire American, and that has a lot of implications with trade, with perhaps a weakening of our alliance or less American aid to NATO. So I think they will be concerned about those kinds of measures.
And Rick, if we could get back to you, I'd like to talk more about specifically the beginning of the speech, and you alluded to it certainly. Politicians prospered, people did not. Their triumphs, not your triumphs. You almost got a sense that you wondered what the expressions were like on all of the lawmakers who were sitting around him, because it really seemed to me that it was put your nose up at them and say, yeah, guys, ladies, everything's changing.
It's very interesting. Donald Trump, from the very beginning, has had this amazing ability as a billionaire to identify with blue-collar workers, and for them to identify with him, which is ironic, given that Mitt Romney didn't have nearly the wealth but was considered removed. And here in this theme, it's sort of an us versus them, we, and that Donald Trump is putting himself beside the worker, beside the people. And that's what he's creating, this us versus them, and he's with them. And I think it's almost a straw man to some extent, although he would claim it's very real. He's going to create those battles. And so how that plays out for him, we will see. I think the speech is important. I think the speech is historic. There were some very good lines in this speech. There were some good themes in this speech. It wasn't, like I said, quite as conciliatory as I would have expected, but in the very beginning, you got a sense of where those themes would be. And I think they became fairly apparent throughout. And it does go to this American first patriotism theme primarily.
Also, we all kind of looked a bit surprised when we saw Charles Schumer up there tendering a speech. Stroke of political genius, conciliatory hand, trying to set a different tone when it comes to working with the Democrats?
I'm not familiar with who set the agenda, but I think it was wise. I do think it was wise to have the minority leader from the Democratic Party, from the Senate, speak today, and to listen to what he had to say. It sounds cliche, but all those voices need to be heard, and all those points of view need to be heard, and there needs to be listening going on in Washington, and I hope there will be. So, if you had to give me a choice, I'd say it was a wise move.
We were watching also as there were a couple of cutaway shots, in fact, Senator Gibson, of President Obama. Well, former President Obama, I should say now. What was your reaction to the look on his face as an example? Because he was basically listening to now President Trump picking apart some of the things that he is most proud of.
And I don't think the president had any particular expression, and I'm not sure that his speech really picked apart the former president's policy so much as, I mean,
critical
it was
of, for example, ISIS and the handling of terrorism.
I guess that was implied.
There was a lot. Look, there was a lot that was implied there.
Implied, but not a lot of detail, which is what you didn't like about this speech.
Exactly. Well, I just think we need a little more detail to have something to grab onto, and I didn't get that sense that, yes, I'm fired up and ready to go. But so I'm not sure where we go from here.
I don't know if you just saw it. President Trump put his hand around President Obama, former President Obama's back, bidding each other farewell. The former president and former first lady will board Marine One. And while all this is going on, there's a flurry of activity in the White House. Believe it or not, in just 5 hours' time, you have one family moving out and another moving in, and they have moving vans that are poised, one to the east and one to the west, ready to take everything that the Obama family had at the White House to their new home in Washington, D.C., and to move whatever the new first family has to make their home comfortable.
It's interesting, too, because we heard President Obama, when he gave his last interview to the news media, he was said, well, they pretty much put it all out on the South Lawn. And we knew that he was just joking, but if you think about, 8 years, not just him, but his children, his daughters as well, and it's flawless, evidently, because they obviously are not going to paint or anything like that, but there's a transition that's going on, not just from what we see here, but also behind the scenes.
They've obviously got it down to a science.
Clearly, they've had many years
clearly,
of experience.
neither the president or the first lady were sitting there worried about how things were being packed up and making sure that nothing got broken. It is on to a congressional luncheon. And then down to business. Rick, earlier we were talking about the fact that there may be some executive actions that are signed today. And you said you didn't expect anything that's going to be earth-shattering. But over the course of the next couple of weeks, what perhaps history-making moves do we expect from the new president and his administration?
Now let's be clear. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump promised on day one he would do several things. And there's a long litany of those. Now, how do you define day one? Is today day one or is Monday day one? I think today what you will see is some executive orders signed that are ceremonial, that are logistical, that relate to security. He may surprise people and do something of more significance today, but I do think you're going to begin to see a flurry of executive orders come on Monday. Many of them will be to fulfill promises to undo some of the executive orders done by President Obama. And one of the challenges for President Obama, we can talk about legacy, but certainly one area was his legislative legacy. And because for whatever reason he wasn't quite as successful legislatively, he did a lot by executive order, and the challenge with that, of course, is that it can be undone by the very next president. One of the reasons why I think he wanted Hillary Clinton to win, of course, was a continuity in those things he's done. Donald Trump is very likely to undo several of those. Starting next week, You can see, notice that we're withdrawing from TPP, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. I think you could see some executive orders relating to immigration. You can see it on the fringes of Obamacare. I think you're going to see a whole flurry of activities on the executive orders come next week.
Let's pause for just a moment and watch if we can. Former President Obama and former First Lady, the party nominee won.
Actually, I don't mean
it's
to
not
correct you,
because the president is not on board.
It's like they use a number of different aircrafts that they designate as Air Force One when the president's on board.
You know, it's a really big moment if you look at that scene. You think of the president, you think of Michelle Obama. It has been a historic presidency. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you agree or disagree on the policies, it has been a historic presidency. And if you were aboard that helicopter right now, wouldn't you want to know, what they're talking about and what they're thinking? It has to be a whole range of emotions. And then you see now President Trump and the First Lady looking on as the former president, Barack Obama, and his wife get ready to leave. It is remarkable in this country that it happens this way. And eight years ago, you can remember George Bush and his graciousness in paving the way for Barack Obama to become president, for which the president was very grateful. That tradition is one that has become deeply ingrained and one that I greatly cherish myself, this way that presidents treat each other. This is a big moment that we're witnessing.
And Senator Gibson, going back to something you talked about a little bit earlier, what's next for President Obama and the First Lady? A bit of a metaphor here. They're not flying off into the sunset. I don't think we've heard the last of the president.
No, we have not, because I think he has unfinished business in moving America forward. I just don't think he's totally done. He's maybe done as the president, obviously, but in terms of social issues that impact people and economic issues that impact people, and as I mentioned earlier, as a former community organizer, he's not yet done. There are still things that he and Michelle want to help people accomplish in their private capacities, and they'll have a broader range to do it, actually. I remember when I went to the convention, and it was John Kerry was running at that time for the nomination, and hardly anybody was in the room at, I think it was like 5 or 6 o'clock, or maybe that night he had prime time, and people started to come back. The first time he spoke at the Democratic convention, and when he was finished, everybody knew that he was not going away. And that is the same thing for today. He's not going away, he's just leaving the White House.
And it's interesting, too, because as we have seen, certainly much shock, of course, with Hillary Clinton among the Democratic Party, the fact that she lost, and a lot of talk about what happened. And, will we see former President Obama then helping to strengthen, perhaps, the Democratic Party now? And Rick, you even mentioned maybe helping others build them up some and help them create new leaders.
This is something that John Dickerson of CBS have been talking about too, this notion of what is the wisest path for President Obama in the future. And would it be in the best interest of the Democratic Party for, in fact, for this to become Donald Trump versus Barack Obama? And probably not. The president himself in his last press conference said what he intends to do is first take a deep breath, spend some time with family, probably do some writing, but there are big issues to him relating to equality, to voter rights, to other kinds of things, those disenfranchised, that he may speak out on. But I do think he has to give an opportunity for the Democratic bench to grow. He's got to let the Democratic bench be productive, to be competitive in the 2018 and in 2020, so he'll give some thought to that. But no, I agree with the senator, he's not going away, but I don't think he's going to have as low a profile as we've seen with former President Bush. On the other hand, I don't think you're going to see him driving politics or policy.
And just very quickly, Dr. Michkowski, your perspective in terms of historically where we have seen presidents who've left office and, either like a Bush, just wanted to be a private citizen, or those who have stayed involved?
I think it's a difficult adjustment because you're suddenly stripped of the power that you used to have. Lyndon Johnson had tremendous trouble going back to his ranch and being deprived of that power. But for all modern presidents, they have two priorities as they leave office. One is raising money for their presidential library, because that comes through private donations until the library and museum are up and running when it gets turned over to the federal government. And the other is writing memoirs. And I think with regard to the first, Barack Obama's presidency will be a very well examined and researched presidency presidency, in part because his presidential library and museum will be in the largest city to host one, Chicago. And I think researchers will love visiting Chicago and visit that museum and research Obama's presidency. So I think a lot of his energies will be devoted toward getting his library and museum off to further his legacy.
That's it. I don't think the museum and library are scheduled to be open until 2020, so there's some time between now and then.